Combining sophisticated paintwork with powerful stabilization techniques has always been a hallmark of Silhouette, but a lot of workflows require the artist to work on a distorted or unwrapped image. Using PowerMesh Morph, driven by the Mocha Pro PowerMesh, artists can now just paint a few keyframes directly on the image, with Silhouette handling the heavy lifting. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris Effects. Let's explore PowerMesh Morph inside of Boris Effects Silhouette. Let's start our exploration of PowerMesh Morph with this tasty shot of a sandwich. This already looks really appetizing, but let's just get rid of a few imperfections. When the hand is pushing down the bread, both the upper and lower crust are showing visible cracks. Also, there are residual crumbs on the tomato that we would like to get rid of as well. There are a number of ways to approach this. We could try to stabilize the different areas with one of the built-in Silhouette trackers and then record the paint strokes. But especially in this moment when the sandwich is squeezed the most, we will most likely run into issues with deformations. Another approach might be to use optical flow to analyze the motion vectors and apply those to a painted frame. Using optical flow will be better suited for this kind of organic deformation, but it does give us very little manual control over the motion. Using a power mesh inside of the Mocha Pro module of Silhouette will give us better control, but traditionally would have required us to unwarp the image, retouch on the unwarped image, and then rewarp it. And while this approach is perfectly viable, looking at a warped image can be disorientating and might make you overlook unwanted features that are much easier to spot if you are looking at the original image instead. PowerMesh Morph is here to address this by using a tracked mesh to morph individual painted frames for the intended duration. Let's pull up a PowerMesh Morph node and take a look at the inputs. We've got an image input. This will be fed by the result of the paint node. The pink Aux image input will come into play a little bit later, but I do want to draw your attention to these two data inputs. The first one, right here next to the Aux input, will require the data output of the paint node. That way the PowerMesh Morph node will get the data on which keyframes we actually painted our sandwich. And last but not least, we need of course to feed in our mesh from this Mocha Pro node here into the PowerMesh Morph node. I already tracked the mesh, but let's open the Mocha interface and have a quick peek at what the mesh actually looks like. It is really important to have a solid mesh tracked for this technique to work, but the beauty is that if any of your mesh points go awry, you can always select to edit the tracked mesh, and that is possible at any step of the process. We've got all our necessary inputs connected, but before we dive into the actual controls of the PowerMesh Morph node, we need something else, some paintwork. Let's start with a frame just before the hand presses down the sandwich and puts everything in motion. That's around frame 29. And let's make sure we've got the alpha selected as a channel to paint on. That will become important a little bit later on. So I will quickly paint away the little tear in the upper and lower crust, this little brown spot here, and the breadcrumbs on our tomatoes. Would this be the traditional Silhouette workflow, we would have selected a layer to stabilize on and recorded those paint strokes for all the frames. But instead, I'm going to let these paint strokes just live here for this single frame. Let's now take a look at the PowerMesh Morph node itself. The most important thing is to select the mesh you want to use for morphing the paint strokes. As we've got just the sandwich mesh tracked, there's not much to choose from, but if this was a more complex setup, we might choose from all the meshes inside the Mocha Pro module. However, one painted frame will not get us very far. If we wanted to just attach a single painted frame, PowerMesh Warp would be your tool of choice. But to really understand the potential of PowerMesh Morph, we need to put up a second painted frame so that Silhouette can morph between those two. Let's find a moment where the sandwich has risen again. It never really totally stops moving. So let's pick the frame where the major movement is done, and that will be on frame 121. As with all paintwork, consistency is really important. I will do my very best to do similar paint strokes to the ones I did on frame 29. Now let's take a look at what is happening inside the PowerMesh Morph node. We do get a really nice morph between both frames, but if we take a closer look, something is still off. Take a look at the edge here. We see a very hard shape here just above the sandwich. Also, let's take a look at the ham, the lettuce and the tomato. At the moment the sandwich is compressed the most, the image is squeezed really drastically, and the fact that we are just blending two painted frames becomes apparent. Luckily, we decided to paint ourselves an alpha channel along with our retouch. Now we can morph that alpha channel along as well and just replace the parts of the image that we actually changed. That will also take care of our edge problem. Let's change the alpha in the PowerMesh Morph settings from mesh to source. We will comp this image back onto our plate in a second, but for now, let's stick with this because it will actually help us to better visualize how to best set up our blending between the different painted frames. If we go to the middle of our morph, we can explore the different views that we've got. Like with the paint node in Silhouette, number key 1 will give you the result view we've been looking at all along. Number key 2 will return the input 1, which is the result of our paint node. Handy if you quickly want to check what you're actually feeding into PowerMesh Morph. Number key 3 would return the Aux input, but that one is currently vacant. It gets really interesting with number key 4. This one will return the image from the beginning of the morph, but with the warping from the mesh applied. And number key 5 will do the same thing for the end image of the morph. And if you want to find what part of your mesh might be causing trouble without going back into the Mocha Pro module, just go for number key 6, which will show you the result, but with a mesh overlay. If we move our cursor on the time bar along the whole range, we can see another problem with our retouch. The morph starts on frame 29 and ends at frame 121. We could add additional paint frames at the very beginning and the very end, but that is just asking for trouble. The movement of the bread is minimal, and I just want the mesh to drive those painted frames for the entire range of the clip. Otherwise, we might introduce unwanted animation between the paint strokes. In the node properties, we can check the boxes for extend start and extend end. Boom. If we now move our cursor back between our two painted frames, we can now play with blend. We can either choose a linear blend or a smooth blend, which will give you more of an ease in, ease out transition. When smooth is enabled, we can also adjust the blend amount. That will weigh your morph to either start earlier or later throughout the transition. While this view on black is quite helpful for illustrating what is happening, we want to see our actual result. So let's pick up a composite node and just add the result of our PowerMesh Morph to the plate. Once we hit unpremultiply, this looks rather nice. However, we are now starting to realize that the sandwich is not only compressing, but there are also lighting changes happening. The way it is now, our tomatoes are getting bright specks because, constrained by our alpha, this is just a morph between two bright phases of our tomatoes. Let's find a frame between our two existing paint frames to morph that in between. We could head straight for the middle, but I've got the feeling that this light change is not totally linear. Let's paint out the breadcrumbs on the tomatoes, as those are giving us those specks. I will choose frame 37 to get a nice, smooth transition in, and frame 99 for a good transition out. If we now take a look at our comp and just shuttle between the two painted frames on frame 99 and frame 121, we can see that the specks are gone, but the bread is now getting back the cracks we just painted out earlier. Uh-oh, what is happening here? Let's take a look at the output of the PowerMesh Morph node. With the painted regions just on black, we can clearly see that the node is doing what it is supposed to do. It is morphing between the individual paint strokes. But as we only painted on the tomatoes and not on the bread, there's a dissolve happening to the original, unretouched crust of the bread. This is just something to be aware of. In this case, you want all the paint frames to include all the detail you want to actually be painted out over time. There are other use cases where you can surely use this behavior to your advantage, but in this case, let's fix it by removing the cracks on these two frames as well. Let's paint in two more frames, just where the tomatoes really get a lot of shadow. We will start on frame 57 with just the specks, just to check whether this is really the best frame to actually paint on. Once we are satisfied with the result, we can quickly take care of the cracks in the crust. Last but not least, we will paint frame 91 to have a smooth transition out. So with a mere 6 single frames, we've retouched the whole clip, which is a huge time saver. Of course, this works on any kind of retouching task, and remember, the better the mesh track and the more consistent your paint work, the better your result will be. Let's dive a little deeper and take a look at a technique that might be helpful when your retouch is about to be obstructed by other foreground objects. PowerMesh Morph offers us two different modes of interpreting the transition between painted keyframes. Note that this pull-down menu will only be active when a paint data output is connected to the appropriate input of the PowerMesh Morph node. The first mode is continuous, which is what we've been using all along. Continuous means that once a morph from one painted frame to the next is finished, it will immediately start morphing into the next painted frame. No matter how many painted keyframes you have, it will continuously morph until it reaches the last keyframes. That is ideal for a shot like our sandwich, where we want to take care of the imperfections that are clearly visible for all or most of the time. The other mode is pairs, which is great for imperfections that appear and disappear over time. When switching to pairs, PowerMesh Morph will pair up keyframes and do individual morphs between them. So the first painted keyframe will morph into the second and be one pair, the third will morph into the fourth and be another pair, and the fifth will morph into the sixth and be another pair yet. You can also see the correlation between frames down here in the ranges info when switching between the two modes. But PowerMesh Morph does not necessarily require a paint node and its data to morph images for you. We can also drive it with an externally created image. In this example, I aged up a single frame of the actress outside of Silhouette and imported it into my session. I hooked up the original plate to the image input, our retouch still to the Aux Input, and just the mesh to our mesh data input. Let's do a little time transition where we begin to age the actress up from the beginning until she reaches the age here on frame 133. For this to work properly, the retouched image should always be the destination of your morph, as the mesh will always align to the image that you defined as the end of your range. You can always use the extend end function to bring it along further, but ideally you should not pick one of the very first few frames. Notice that now that we've not connected a paint data input, we can't choose between continuous and pairs mode anymore. That is by design, as the morph duration will no longer be determined by the paint keyframes, but by the range we set up here. So the morph starts on whatever frame we define here and ends on frame 133. PowerMesh Morph offers great possibilities for organic retouch while still maintaining fine control over the whole process. If you want to dive deeper into mesh tracking with the Mocha Pro module or the sophisticated paint tools inside of Silhouette, check out our other tutorials on boriseffects.com. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris Effects, and I will see you in another video.